All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third panel. I'm glad we got you after your Fed. My name is Pooja. I'm the East Texas reporter for the Texas Tribune, and we have a great group of panelists here, so I'll just briefly introduce everyone before we get into questions. So to my immediate left, we have Kelty Garby, who is Executive Director of Texas Rural Funders, which focuses on philanthropy in rural Texas, including in the area of rural broadband. Dr. Garby has 20 years of experience with nonprofits, state government, and philanthropy. Next, we have Joshua Roberts, who is a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin and a founding partner of Idea Smiths LLC, and I recently learned a native of Nacogdoches. He focuses on the bulk electricity system and the impacts of energy efficiency. Then we have Kelly Holcomb, who is the general manager of the Angelina Neches River Authority, which is responsible for preserving water from the state's third largest river basin. He's also a native Texan and has been in the water business for 4 decades. Charlie Cano, last but not least, is a veteran of the telecom industry with diverse experience as a design engineer, project manager, and sales director. He is now CEO at eTex, an East Texas-based telecom company, and a strong advocate for rural broadband. So thank you all so much for joining us. To start, we know Texas's population is growing at unprecedented rates, straining Texas's aging infrastructure, especially amid an increasing number of extreme weather events. And those challenges are especially heightened in rural areas where resources and funding are limited. And as we've already touched on, the November election includes several ballot measures focused on infrastructure, including these 3 areas. So that's Prop 6, 7, and 8. So I wanted to start by just kind of getting everybody grounded in what the issues are in those areas. So maybe Joshua, if you can start kind of laying out what are the challenges that we face in the energy space in rural Texas?
So I mean, some of the you all hear me? Okay, there we go. So some of the issues we're facing broadly in Texas, including across the entire state, are just, as you mentioned, a growing Texas population. We're headed towards 50 million Texans by 2050, and we've seen a large growth in the amount of electricity that has been demanded. In fact, this past year we saw 4 times the amount of peak demand growth than we've seen in the past years across the entire state, as more industries are moving here, as more people are moving here, and that is putting a toll on our infrastructure. The average natural gas power plant in the state's 30 years old. The average coal plant's 40 years old. The average power line out there is pushing 40 years old as well. And everything has a shelf life. And so if we are going to and at the same time, we're changing what types of generation resources and things like that we are using to, meet that demand. And so if we're going to, change the system while also increasing, the amount of energy that we're going to consume, I mean, we're going to have to make sure we have the infrastructure to do it.
And while you're speaking, we know that Proposition 7 is a vote about whether to approve low-interest loans for gas plants. So do you think that can you kind of explain what that would do, and should people support the state giving funding for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that's based off of Senate Bill 2627, which was passed by the Texas legislature this past year and signed by the governor. And essentially what it does is it offers low-cost state loans to private companies to build natural gas power plants. Now, it's a little bit different depending on what part of Texas you're in. Most of the funds go towards the part of Texas that is in ERCOT, so the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's the grid that serves most of the state, about 90% of the state, except a large chunk of East Texas is actually not in ERCOT. There's only about $1 billion out of the 10 or so that's allocated in that legislation that would go more towards modernizing and weatherizing things like distribution lines and weatherizing power plants and other things like that. The bulk of the money would be going towards the part of Texas in the ERCOT region, which would provide low-cost loans to build dispatchable power plants. The only types of dispatchable power plants we're building these days are natural gas. Theoretically, they could go towards coal, but no one's building one of those in the entire country. And so essentially, the reason we have to vote on it is because we'd be using state funds for private companies, because in the state of Texas, private companies build power plants, unlike in some others. Whether or not you should vote on it is an interesting question. One of the issues that complicates things is this is not the only piece of energy legislation that was passed this past year. There was another bill, HB 1500, which we don't have to vote on, which is also injecting billions of dollars into the Texas energy space. And one of the frustrating things about one who models these types of things and does and looks at the impacts of legislation like this is that generally you want to try to look at one thing at a time to see how it's going to impact things. Well, they threw a whole bunch of things at the system, and one of those things has already costed about $10 billion over 3 months, given a report from the recent market monitor who monitors ERCOT. So there's already billions of dollars being poured into it this year alone. And so I don't actually know that we need billions more poured into it if we're already pouring billions into it now.
Okay, interesting. And I think shifting gears to water, Kelly, kind of lay out for us what you're seeing with water infrastructure in rural Texas, water and wastewater.
Thank you, Pooja. East Texas is not unique in terms of its water system and water infrastructure as a whole. From the folks that I talk with, the entire state suffers from the same problem. Most rural water supply systems were created, we're talking non-municipal systems, were created in the 60s and 70s. So that infrastructure is aging out. It's 50 plus years old in many cases. And as we talk about broadband here in a little bit, that broadband and what COVID did for us in some cases with regard to remote work has now made living in Houston a lot less desirable, and moving out into countryside in places where we reside much more desirable, which ultimately places a strain on the existing infrastructure. Here in Angelina County alone, there are half a dozen water systems that have failed, that are currently failed. There's no one to pick those water systems up because they're so small. In order to fix them, you're having to spend, $1 million minimum on a small water system, and folks can't afford the bill. They simply cannot afford the bill. There's less wastewater infrastructure in rural communities in Texas, East Texas especially, but it's the same issue.
Yeah. And then I want to bring in broadband to the conversation. And I think with broadband, it's a little bit different because we just don't have a lot of the infrastructure there. It's not so much necessarily aging infrastructure. But anyways, Charlie and also Kelty, if you both want to talk about what it looks like, what the rural broadband infrastructure looks like right now.
So broadband is something that really, it's not new to us as a provider. We've been working on broadband infrastructure for 10 plus years. It's just that the technology is growing so fast. It's the fastest changing industry compared, to any others, and it's so much needed by all the other industries. So, we're a telephone co-op that started out with copper cables, 70 plus years old. And, while the technology started out as dial-up and then went to DSL, we now understand that that's not enough to handle the demand. So, to your point, we can't use copper technology anymore, so we're using fiber optics. We know that that's the best technology. My background being in engineering, I did a lot of designs. The same fiber optic cable right now that the standard is 100 by 20 that everybody's shooting for, the same strand of the fiber that can provide 100 megs is the same strand that could be used to provide 400 or 800 gigs. So, there's a difference in comparing technologies. So the challenge is the affordability not only to install, maintain, and operate that kind of a network, making it affordable for the consumer, but just having the same problem as water meters and power meters. The rural aspect of it is very challenging. In my territory, our density is about 7 houses per square mile. So it's a higher cost for us to, and in our case, we bury all of our facilities. It's a higher cost to do all of that with that low density to be able to have enough end user revenue to help continue the ongoing maintenance and operations of that. So it's just a slower pace on something that's very high demand right now.
From the Texas Rural Funders perspective, the way that we talk about and try and demystify broadband is thinking about it as a three-legged stool and talking about access, adoption, and use. And so what Charlie's just talking about, building the physical infrastructure, is the access component. And the adoption piece would be, for example, the Deep East Texas Council of Governments did a study and found that people in Deep East Texas were paying twice as much for half the speed compared to people in Dallas. And so the question is that really worth it if you have the infrastructure available? And then use is having the devices. And in a lot of rural areas of the state, people either have no stool at all or their stool has maybe one leg. And so when you think about the Proposition 8 legislation, that gives people in rural Texas the option to build the infrastructure and make sure that they have the three-legged stool that we talk about.
So while we're talking about Proposition 8, we know from the earlier panel that would create the Broadband Infrastructure Fund and set aside $1.5 billion to expand high-speed broadband access. So Charlie, going back to you, explain to us how a provider could tap into that funding if that is passed.
Well, that will provide the funding, and we talked about in an earlier session, the creation of the Broadband Development Office. So then they are still yet to finalize the details on how that's going to be distributed. But how it would help us as a provider is, I've got a forecastable revenue base and cash that I have to use and create my capital budget. So if I had access as a provider, I'd be able to accelerate the build out of these broadband networks and upgrade to my customers. So definitely getting it quicker to my customer base is going to be a positive. So I think I would be a proponent of Proposition 8, and I would encourage everybody to vote for that.
And if you can, there was a specific number you were sharing with me yesterday about how something that would take 10 years now could take 5 years with this funding.
So in my specific case, I'm looking at about $55 million, and again with my current budget, that's going to take me 10 plus years to be able to build out $55 million worth of fiber optic cable to my customers. And so having access to this, I'd be able to cut that down in 5 years and not put the company in any kind of strain and any kind of serious debt, and still remain whole to where we can then continue to have the cash flow to operate and maintain it and making it reliable and scalable for future demands.
And Kelty, are you in support of voters voting for this proposition?
Yes, and just to elaborate on what Charlie's talking about with the Broadband Development Office. So what they're doing right now is collecting data, mapping the state, and creating a grant distribution process. And the grant is focused on unserved and underserved areas of the state. And so the work that they're doing right now to figure out how to allocate those dollars is really important. And many, many rural areas of the state fall into those unserved and underserved categories. And so it's important to know that this $1.5 billion is flexible and will flow faster than some federal dollars. It's useful to know that at the national level, about $42 billion has been allocated across the country to different states. Texas got $3.3 billion, which is more than any other state, and it's an indication of the need. This $1.5 billion can be used in a lot of different ways and faster. It can also be used as some of the required matches for the federal dollars. And so we look at it as helping unlock and activate the $3.3 billion.
So similarly with water, we have Proposition 6, which would create the Texas Water Fund, which would allocate $1 billion to support a variety of projects such as fixing Texas's aging pipes, acquiring more water sources, and mitigating water loss. And I think the important piece for this conversation is that part of that fund has to be used for water infrastructure projects in rural areas. So Kelly, how are you thinking about this proposition, and would you urge voters to support that measure?
I would definitely urge voters to support it. The way funding in Texas works for water-related projects, you've got two primary methods of funding. If you're a water supply corporation, which Texas has a large number of water supply corporations, you can go to your local bank and you can borrow money from any commercial lending institution. If you're a government entity, you're capped. You're extremely limited as to the avenues that you can go to borrow funding. The Water Development Board, Texas Water Development Board, is the state's water bank for water-related projects, water and sewer-related projects. Many people probably don't know this because you don't think about it every day like most of us do in the water business. Texas Water Development Board's funding, their portfolio is capped at $6 billion, which means that when they're managing the delta in what their portfolio currently has and what they can borrow and fund projects with statewide. So this $1 billion is going to be put into their portfolio and their checking account, if you will, so that they can fund projects. $250 million of that's going to go for the new water supply for Texas fund, and the other $750 million is going to go for funding rural projects, primarily infrastructure related to distribution networks and so forth. I was looking at some stats the other day, and by some estimates, there are about 500,000 acre feet of water that is lost due to leaking water distribution systems statewide. So when you look at the cost of that, you're talking multi-billions of dollars worth of water lost over time that we don't calculate, nobody talks about. This $750 million that's going to be allocated to the Water Development Board is going to have strings attached. It always does. We don't know what those strings are in detail at the moment because the Water Development Board has to go through rulemaking to be able to establish the new programs and all the lending criteria associated with it. But that $750 million is going to be distributed over a half a dozen existing funds that folks in the water business will be able to go take advantage of almost immediately once the election is hopefully passes Prop 6. So what does that mean for Texas? Well, that means for these rural systems that are out there in the world, if you need money, you'll be able to go to the Water Development Board and borrow money, but there's going to be one caveat. You're going to have to raise rates. I live in the country. I'm on a water supply corporation. The base rate for water at my house is $18.12 a month. It's the least expensive liquid you'll ever drink, but yet we complain the most about that cost. Same thing with broadband. I mean, you and I have a lot of common issues. We measure, our service by meters per mile, just like you do, rather than if you're in a municipality, you do it meters per feet. So rural infrastructure as a whole is just much more expensive. For example, in terms of the funding side of this equation, the Rural Water Assistance Fund has never been funded. It's been on the books for many, many years, but it's never been funded. We're hoping that this is going to be funded out of this $750 million. The state revolving fund is 7 times oversubscribed, meaning every year the Water Development Board gets 7 times more applications for 7 times more money than they have to lend. We think the majority of that money is going to go to the SRF program. The SRF program has interest rate buy downs and so forth that make it very attractive, especially in today's marketplace with regard to borrowing money. So from where I stand, this $1 billion that's going to be infused into the water industry is hopefully the first step, the first real step in going toward funding rural water in the state of Texas, which is sorely needed.
And you mentioned water rates and systems need to increase their rates and that rural infrastructure is expensive. I'm curious if with broadband, because we heard the stat that the rates that we're paying in rural Deep East Texas are double that in Dallas. Is there anything that you, like as a provider or that as a philanthropic network, are doing to think about lowering those rates?
Okay. So what we're trying to do is bring attention to all of the information and resources out there. We just put out a report called Finding Funding for Fiber to help explain how the capital stacks work and what it looks like in different parts of the state. Charlie and a group of his colleagues have done some really great presentations looking at both the technology and the finance behind broadband. And so we're trying to demystify that and help shine a light on it. And the point that it is more expensive to do things in rural, yes, it is. There are 3 million rural Texans, which is more than the population of many other states. And from the perspective of Texas Rural Funders, we think a lot about the fact that rural and urban are linked. And people may not always recognize that and think about, and you all who are in rural communities know that food and water comes from rural areas to urban areas. Our joke at Texas Rural Funders is if you like eating beef, those cows are not grown on the back parking lot at HEB. You know, and I think that drives it home, but there are so many other ways. And one example is thinking about Next Gen 911, which will be all based on broadband. I don't know about you, but I want to make sure that my ambulance or my policeman or fire truck is completely connected all the way through when they're helping me. And rural areas pay a lot more for 911. And so, you know, we have members of Texas Rural Funders who are taking different approaches at the access, adoption, use. Here in East Texas, the Temple Foundation has worked with DP's Texas Council of Governments to help support the study that I mentioned earlier. We have members in other parts of the state that are working on device access. So yes, the infrastructure is so expensive. And one of the things that we think about, there's examples in other parts of the state where they came up with a plan and sought funding during COVID, supply chain problems and labor increased the cost. And so one of the things we think about is this investment of dollars right now. It's less expensive at this moment than it's going to be even in a couple of years.
And I want to add to that it's a double-edged sword. You know, I serve in a couple in counties that, you know, it's got some of the lowest medium income, you know, per family, per household. So I'm very sensitive to the fact that it needs to be affordable. One of the differences is the expectation of broadband is everybody wants it unlimited. The more water you use, the more you pay. The more power you use, the more you pay. On broadband, it's a race to zero. Everybody wants it affordable, unlimited for $30. Well, that's going to put us in a bind if we're trying to save up for necessary upgrades in the next 7 to 10 years, because broadband consumption is growing at leaps and bounds exponentially. And so while the 100 meg is the threshold and the goal that we're reaching for today, it's going to be a gig in 5 years. It's going to be 10 gig per household in 10 years. So we have to, even though fiber is the best technology to use, you got to change the equipment on either end of that as those prices come down on those cards and the electronics. We got to upgrade that every 7 to 10 years. So again, it's a double-edged sword. I want it to be affordable. I appreciate the ACP program and some of these other programs to help some of these families in need, to help them to afford it. But we can't give it away, because if we do that, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot and having to upgrade everything all over again and needing the funding for that, you know, in the next 10 years.
Joshua, I want to go back to you. You mentioned, I know you've done a lot of work on ERCOT, but you also said that, you know, a lot of East Texas is not part of ERCOT. So I wanted to ask what we can expect for reliability of the grid coming up this year, if you can give us any kind of forecast, and also just what that means for East Texas if we're not part of that.
Yeah, so that's the question everyone's asking: is are the lights going to stay on? Because unfortunately, we've had some issues lately, or the past couple of years, where they haven't stayed on. So if we have a normal winter, if we don't have any major hurricanes that make their way, you know, up this far, if we don't have another winter storm Uri, and you know we have everything is kind of average, then I think we'll be fine. We've got lots of reserves. We've got plenty of reserve margins for that kind of thing. it is those tail risk events that are kind of what drive, at least for the large grid, to go down. The majority of the time when people experience the power going out, it's the small wires and poles, it's the distribution, it's the last mile, if it were, tree limbs falling or, things freezing or things like that. It's not very often we have, the spectacular failure of the entire system like we saw during Winter Storm Uri. And so I can't say, if there's not going to be a thunderstorm that's going to come through and knock down a branch and, not take your power out, because that happens, particularly in places where lots of trees are. That happens more frequently. And so, whether we'll have enough power plants to meet demand, I think we'll probably be fine, unless we have another storm that comes through and freezes half of them and cripples our natural gas system, and you'd have this cascading failure of events. The thing about the part of East Texas, which is in the Northeast Texas, is kind of one county on the border that's not in ERCOT, but then kind of south of here, you kind of go all the way, you kind of carves in towards Orange and northeast of Houston. That's part of a much larger grid. The same wires that are operating in that system are running all the way to Florida, running all the way to Maine, and actually up into Canada too. And so there's more power plants on that side, but that doesn't always mean that the transmission lines are going to be able to provide the power. We've seen some situations where we have, hurricanes hit New Orleans and take out, 9 out of the 10 power lines going into the city, and the whole thing goes down, and a whole lot of the rural areas around it also go down. So I'm generally a proponent of we need to upgrade the transmission and distribution system, because that is where we see a lot of the issues. But it's I don't know, read the Farmer's Almanac and we'll see.
And you mentioned, a lot of what you mentioned are these extreme weather events, hurricanes, the freeze, and we know that like with water, the drought has affected some of the infrastructure. So I'm not going to ask about climate change since since that's a tricky one, but just with these extreme weather events becoming more common, we've seen that happen. What do we need to be doing to prepare the infrastructure for that? And is any of the funding going to be used for that?
So, on the energy side, if you just look at the number of billion-dollar disasters that the state just racks up over time, they are increasing. So regardless of what you believe, we are seeing more disasters that are costing $1 billion or more when it comes to insured losses and other types of things. And some of that comes with just more people being in an area to be impacted by a particular storm that rolls through. If there were less before, less damages. If there's more after, more damages. A warmer Gulf does mean that there's going to be stronger hurricanes. That's just physics. That's just the way that piece works. And sometimes they do make it all the way up here, and can still be hurricanes by the time they're all the way up into this part of the state. I think we need to we have. Like we talked about earlier, like the water system being built, 50, 60, 70 years ago, the majority of the energy system was also built 50, 60, 70 years ago. We built a lot of the corridors, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the big transmission lines and distribution lines were built kind of after that World War II boom in population, when everybody was moving around and wanting energy, growing families, things like that. We've been coasting on that infrastructure for a long time. And then as demand grows and as patterns change, we're going to need to upgrade it.
Kelly, tell us how the weather events have affected the water infrastructure.
It affects the way we manage our infrastructure more so than the infrastructure itself. For example, we're required to put an emergency generator on every water plant now. That wasn't the case 5 years ago. Wastewater systems, every improvement that we build, we are putting generators everywhere. We're becoming our own electric gen facility, just in little small footprints all over the place. I think part of the issue, to kind of piggyback off what you were discussing, is that we expect more from our utilities than we did in the past. 50 years ago, I don't have the stats on this, but a large percentage of rural Texas still drew their water from a well. They didn't have the availability of walking into the kitchen, flipping a little lever and letting it run until you decided to turn it off. That's what we have today. We have it with broadband, you have electricity. That's the demands we are placing on our public utilities. And if we don't figure out this model on how we're going to fund that infrastructure, who's going to pay for it, at some point, you're going to have continual failures, interruptions in service. And let's face it, we have gotten to a point in society that we don't want to tolerate those interruptions. We just don't. I mean, I don't like it for sure, but it happens. And if you're on the utility side of that equation, it happens way more frequently than you want it to. So we're having to manage our utilities better than we did before as a result of these weather events that continue to happen.
From our perspective, power is a big challenge. There are a lot of outages, like you said. It's just inevitable. Limbs are going to fall. Certain parts of the network are going to go down from a power perspective. So we have had to invest in a lot in generators. So a lot of our main central offices of equipment have emergency, permanently installed generators. Well, we also have a lot of cabinets out in the field. And while they have 8-hour battery backup, so when the power goes down, we can't justify putting, big generators in a corner of somebody's yard. And so what we have is we deploy, these mobile generators on the back of pickup trucks. My construction guys load these up and they go out there and they recharge these batteries. And they move around the county, multiple counties doing that. Because when there was a power outage, there's an expectation that, you want 911 services still to work. The phone needs to work. Some broadband connections are crucial for emergency services. So we've had to invest a lot more on just backup power from that perspective. But, to further answer your question on what are we doing to try to manage, these emergencies and weather events. Engineering best practices really have to come into play. In East Texas, we're very fortunate to have a lot of sandy soil. So for me, again, I mentioned earlier, we bury all of our fiber optics and cable facilities underground. We use directional drilling, so it's less invasive to, the environment. And we've been tested, unfortunately, in the last couple of years. We had a tornado that hit Upshur County and went 40 miles long and about 800 yards wide and damaged a ton of, trees and aerial utilities. Because we have everything underground, we had zero outages based on that weather. And so instead of my crews having to go out there and repair our services, we got to go out there and help our residents, dig them out of houses and kind of help them from that perspective. Just this summer, we had straight line winds that knocked out, 400,000 or more power meters in East Texas. And so again, those straight line winds and those trees falling over and those tree limbs did not affect any of our network because again, it's underground. So I think every provider should have a responsibility of just doing and utilizing best engineering practices to install the utilities, in their area. Unfortunately, different parts of the state are a lot more challenging. You have Central Texas, you have a lot of rock, it's a lot higher cost to build things underground. So we're fortunate from that perspective. Do I spend a little bit more money burying everything? Yes, I do compared to, aerial. But I think the proof is in the fact that we've been able to have a more stable network. A lot of these anchor institutions, the schools, we connect to over 40 schools, colleges, and universities now in East Texas, over 100 cell towers in East Texas. So the fact that a lot of those entities have come in to us and use us as their fiber broadband provider lets me know that we're doing things the right way and we're using best engineering practices to make it stable.
Joshua, could we ever see a world in Texas where the power lines are underground?
I mean, as an engineer, I would love to see that infrastructure go underground because for a lot of the same reasons we talked about, that were talked about before, is it's one of the more exposed bits of utility out there. The problem is currently it is quite a bit more expensive to do so. You've got issues with magnetic fields caused by wires being close together. There's a whole bunch of electrical engineering issues associated with burying them. one of the nice things is you do get less people fighting you over them because you don't have to look at them. If they're, you get a lot of people fighting over infrastructure siting because they don't like looking at it underground. It's a little bit easier because you don't have to see it, kind of set it and forget it. But yeah, it's just harder, and there's a lot more of it to do. But in some critical corridors, you are starting to see it. California's doing a lot of it because they're starting wildfires and things like that. But yeah, it's going to be a while before we get there.
And I want to add to that the other complexity, the fact of we do have a lot of people building a fence, doing their own projects out in the field. A lot of our last mile, they do not do a good job of calling 811 to locate. And so while I don't like them hitting one of our fiber optic cables or telephone lines that's underground, we locate all of that. I would hate to see what happens if they would accidentally dig a fence post and hit a power line underground.
I mean, I can tell you a story from West Texas where somebody was digging and didn't know that there was dark fiber there. They cut a line and cut off all the power, the broadband to Sul Ross State University. So it does actually happen.
Well, another thing is that we're all fighting for the same utility corridor. And at some point, it wasn't you, but contractors running fiber, they hurt us when they came through Angelina County, tearing water utilities, distribution system, collection systems apart in some cases. And I don't know how we address that, but it's something that needs to be talked about. TxDOT has got a 5-foot corridor on all of their right-of-ways, and they want you to stay within this 5-foot corridor. That's free, doesn't cost you anything. Well, that corridor is filled with utilities. And if you want to go private easements, you've got the same issues. We're all fighting for private easements that cost a whole lot more money to obtain. And the property owners now kind of realize that they have us in a bit of a pickle, so they're not giving those utility corridors up very cheaply. And that's a rising cost for us in terms of best engineering practices.
We had a question earlier from an audience member during the first panel about how, with these propositions and the possible funding, providers have to have some sort of skin in the game. But will they be forced to kind of continue the maintenance of the, let's say, the broadband infrastructure that they create? One of the things that I've heard a lot from rural folks when there's some kind of outage is that they feel like because there's like a monopoly on the provider, they don't get service very quickly. So how will you kind of manage that, Charlie, and all of you? Do you see that playing out here?
So yeah, it was mentioned that Senator Nichols had pushed for again providers having a skin in the game, and I agree with that. I'm in agreement that as a provider, as much as I would love free money and not have to put anything in, I think it's important that we match a certain percentage of that, because what that does is it guarantees that somebody is serious to doing what needs to be done to build that infrastructure. You don't get a new entry or a fly-by-night company that tries to use an alternative technology to do kind of a Band-Aid approach as far as providing broadband services. So I'm definitely for skin in the game. It's just that sometimes these projects get so big that we need to be creative on how we can maybe partner with the cities or the counties so we can leverage our combined letter of credit or something to kind of be able to handle a bigger project. But then the other part is, I guess I wish there was an Angie's list of providers of who the good players are and who the bad players. I would like to see more the local county officials, leaders, to have some input to the Broadband Development Office on who those awardees are going to be, because living in the area that I serve, there's definitely a lot of accountability, because if I don't do what I promised you I was going to do, you're going to see me at church, you're going to see me at the ball game, you're going to see me at the grocery store. And so there's important engagement, local collaboration with the communities that providers need to provide to have that accountability. So for me, that's not a big issue, because all of my employees live and serve and work in the areas that they grew up in. So we know a lot of our customers. So I welcome that, where I think that, again, there's been some examples where some companies may not follow through with really good practices on technical support and response time.
Kelly, one of the questions I had for you is one of the things that we're seeing with water entities is that there's some consolidation happening. And I know that Angelina Neches River Authority has taken over at least one failing water system recently in Nacogdoches. How is that going, and do you expect to see more of that?
Yes, it's going. In this particular case, well, there are a couple of things. You're talking about regionalization of water and sewer utilities. In our industry, regionalization is not easy, and there has got to be some legislative intervention to make regionalization of two entities who are both consenting and their customers are consenting to combine and become one entity. It's got to be quicker and easier. The last one we did was on a true PUC-based process. Took us 18 months to get the approval done from PUC. In this case, there were no protests. 100% of the customer base that voted affirmatively to make it happen, and it took us 18 months to get it done after that. And oh, by the way, the funding process for fixing that problem, $7.7 million, $7.7 million for 233 customers. Now, 70% of that was grant through one of the Water Development Board's state revolving funds. But customers are going to have to pay back the remaining 30%. Who pays for it? We've already got big grants from the state of Texas. It is what we refer to as a second type of regionalization. Typically, it's water system to water system. In this case, it is because we're a rural provider, we're consolidating water systems all over the place into our organization that has the financial, managerial, and technical capabilities to be able to do this and to run these systems and comply with state and federal regulations. In this case, this little water system, which is south of Lufkin, their water bill is going to go from $30 a month to probably close to $100 a month. And they don't like it. We don't like it. But had we not come to the table, what would have happened? They would have continued to drink the nasty water they had, outages all the time. And I frequently get this question asked of me, well, our water bill's $100 a month. I live in Austin. It's $150 a month. That's not high. Well, that's great, but all of the communities, most of the communities in East Texas, you go one county east of here, St. Augustine, Russ, St. Augustine, Sabine counties, their median household income is well below the state LMI. $100 to one of those households for a water bill has significantly more impact than it does to somebody living in Austin whose average household income is $150K a year. Consolidation is going to continue. It has been legislatively mandated in our industry, for example. People still resist it because they know that when somebody like us comes along and says, yes, we're willing to take you over, it means my water bill is going up. But the only reason they would come and approach us is because they have problems they can't solve for themselves and they've got to do something. So it's kind of a necessary evil. I see it as the only way to resolve a lot of these problems in rural communities. And we're not the only entity out there that does this, but we're probably one of the more higher profile entities in our part of the world.
We're going to shift to audience questions in about 2 minutes. So if you have a question, feel free to make your way down to, we have one microphone. And if you're online, please don't hesitate to submit a question. And in the meantime, I'll ask our panelists a final question. What can we in rural areas be doing to kind of set ourselves up for success with the possible influx of funding?
That's a good question. So the Broadband Office has a public comment period that's about to open up on October 13th through November 12th. It's in the Texas Register, and it lays out the definitions of unserved and underserved. There is the opportunity to give feedback that way. Once a month, the Broadband Office does a local government roundtable. Even though it's called Local Government Roundtable, anyone can go and listen and ask questions and find out what's going on. Texas Rural Funders has recommended, as have many other broadband experts, work regionally when it comes to broadband. One thing that we've seen is people want to go county by county and work as one individual county, but in a rural area, you need the economies of scale to create the business demand that makes Charlie be able to come and provide broadband to more people. So I think working as a group, it's hard to watch. I worked in education before, and there were education models that are being implemented all across the state. And as communities are trying to bring themselves broadband, many of them have created nonprofits. So I would say wherever possible, work with existing entities, whether that's a council of governments, local government, a college or university, rather than trying to go it alone.
All right, I guess we can start here with Ellen.
My name is Ellen Temple, and I'm from Lufkin. And I just want to thank Texas Tribune and each of the speakers for the program today. It's been fabulous. And I want to understand the water fund better. So I'm going to turn to Kelly.
Okay.
And I know that we need work on the infrastructure, but I know that there's a part of this water fund that's going for water supply for Texas.
Yes, ma'am.
And my question for you is, will you, as Angelina Natchez River Authority, and focused on dam building, you've got a proposal for a dam on Mud Creek
Yes, ma'am.
in the middle of Cherokee County. Are you going to be able to go to this fund, apply to this fund to help you build that dam?
No, ma'am, we are not. That $250 million is allocated between 3 different new technologies, we'll call them. I just went blank, Ms. Temple, I'm so sorry. Aquifer storage and recovery is one of those. Water from the oil and gas industry, and
Desalination.
desal, there you go. Of those 3, desal is going to be the largest recipient of that money because with desal, it's an unlimited water supply, and with unlimited water supply, you can get the benefits of that greater supply over a much longer period of time. But it's only going to affect coastal regions, so folks like Houston and Corpus Christi and others are the ones that are going to get that. Some inland water desal, but not very much. Unfortunately, reservoirs were not in that list, specifically weren't in that list, because they want to, as I understand the ledge, wanted to promote these other technologies that are lesser used and are viable options in some cases for some water suppliers. But also the fourth leg of that is it will also fund the transmission components of those specific new water supplies. So there are 4 funding components.
Okay. Well, I'm very relieved because I thought, oh my gosh, we've fought dams here. You know, we've got some of the last remaining bottomland forests in the United States in the Natchez River Basin. And so we've fought dams, and then I was so worried that this water fund would be, helping make those dams happen. So
No,
thank you. That relieves my mind a lot.
Well, just as before you leave, if you don't mind, Ms. Temple, the state of Texas does regional water planning. It's been doing regional water planning since the late 90s. As it stands today, we are 7 million acre feet of water short by the year 2070. It's a 50-year planning horizon. And the water has got to come from somewhere. People are moving to the state of Texas, both legally and illegally. They're coming, they're here. It's not going to slow down anytime soon. I don't know how to meet the demands. These 3 new demands for the new water supply contained in Senate Bill 28 won't get us there. It will help. It will help soon, sooner rather than later, but it's not going to get us to that 7 million acre foot shortage of water. And that is a huge amount of water with a lot of zeros in that number. So, but it won't fund it. No,
They
ma'am.
need to copy El Paso. in water conservation.
That's,
But, yeah, that's another conversation, so
It
thank
is.
you
Yes,
so
ma'am.
much.
Thank you.
I am relieved. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. If you have any other questions, feel free to come down. But in the meantime, if I do have one more question. Do you have an example, maybe Kelty or Charlie, of what it looks like to successfully bring broadband to a rural community?
So, yeah, many examples. One in particular, we were able to expand. Well, where do I start? I guess the number one example is just giving the schools a better connection. You know, I have heard horror stories of schools that were connected to an existing fiber provider where the network went down in the middle of test taking, so these kids had to be bused over to a different campus to then finish their tests. You know, how good is the performance going to be on those, those kinds of examples. So just a more reliable network for the schools. Another example I can give you is just going into a community that did not have fiber optics in their downtown area, and as soon as we built fiber down their main business corridor, it boosted their economic development. A lot of people then started buying these downtown vacant business, storefronts, and some people just for residential use were starting to buy some of these storefronts in the downtown area. So just all the things that everybody's already talked about all morning long: healthcare, education, business development. There's tons of examples of that in a small scale and in a large scale. So we're excited to be, in this industry, to be providing these connections. We just need the funds and the boost to get it done faster.
If I can actually veer out of my lane a little bit and talk about broadband too, in a way that relates to electricity, I think if we hadn't had the Rural Electrification Act in the 1930s, that there might still be rural parts of states that wouldn't have electricity. Like if we didn't do that push to force, even though it's more expensive to push it, there might still be parts that wouldn't have it, even today.
if you don't mind, Pooja, we're all inextricably linked here in the services we provide. I need your electricity for my pumps. I need your broadband for my SCADA and my monitoring systems that everything is moving towards these days. Technology has advanced to the point that we don't do anything in our business anymore without integrating technology directly into the operation. So we can sit here from a cell phone and I can operate one of my water treatment plants or any lift station that we have with my cell phone. And I need you on the other end of that, being able to provide that connectivity back to me so that I can do all this, which helps me save labor and respond quicker and all those things that you, the consumer, are demanding from us.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought we had a question there. Joshua, one of the things that I've heard with Prop 7 is, I mean, you were kind of questioning whether it's even necessary to have this additional funding, but another question I've heard is about, these natural gas power plants would contribute to emissions. And so I wanted to ask you about like alternative energy and sources and anything we should know about kind of what's going on there.
Yeah, so I mean, we've seen a large growth in the amount of wind and solar in this state, and the vast majority of that has gone to rural counties. Fortunately, a lot of those rural counties are rural counties in West Texas. There's not as much that's happened here, just given the climatic differences across the state. I will say one thing's investing in more natural gas power plants. One of the things that could come back to bite us a little bit would be is at the same time that we'd be building power plants that consume natural gas, we're also exporting a lot of natural gas, particularly from the state. And just like anytime someone in the Middle East decides they want the price of oil to be higher, if we get tied to a global market of natural gas, we might then become beholden to global prices of natural gas, which are generally 2 to 3 to 4 times higher than we've enjoyed paying in this state so far. So the more we tie ourselves to some technologies that are then getting tied to global markets, I think we'll get more deeply tied into things that into things that are traditionally higher price or that have been higher priced. Things like wind and solar, they don't require fuel. They make a lot of cheap energy, but we do need to make sure that we have the ability to provide the power whenever people want it. The sun does go down, the wind does stop shining. The sun goes down, the wind stops blowing. Sometimes. One of the things about this bill that I was a little frustrated with is it does not include things for like battery storage. So you can't apply these loan programs. They only go towards things like natural gas power plants, not battery storage. When if you look at the interconnection queue, that's what people are trying to build. That's what people want to build in the state, are renewables and storage, because it makes for pretty cheap power. There's nothing stopping energy storage from being sited around here. In fact, there's quite a bit of already projects that are looking to move forward.
You talked about kind of the changing sources, I guess, of energy, and I was thinking about Kelly with you had mentioned changing technologies in terms of how you're managing your plants. We know that the infrastructure we have now from the 60s has aged out. Are there changes in technology that are going to allow the water infrastructure to last longer, or are we going to have this same problem, 40 years from now?
I think the answer is we're going to have the same problems. I don't know that it'll be 40 years from now. Yes, there is new technology that's out there in the world that is being implemented. I mean, some plumbing fixtures, plumbing parts, right? Every time we've had a deep freeze over in East Texas, the run on plumbing supplies at Home Depot, Lowe's, and every other outfit in town, I mean, you're standing in line waiting for it. Those types of things have generated technology that make it quicker, easier, simpler, and longer-lasting materials that we are now beginning to integrate into the water systems that we operate. Things that just weren't heard of 10 years ago. The question is, we're implementing it, we've committed to doing it, not just us, but a lot of others in the industry. How long is it going to last? We don't know that until we actually go through that timeline to see what happens when that day comes.
I think the theme, if I could add to that, the theme that unifies all of us here is the fact that, to your point, there's no such thing as a one-time fix for any of these utilities. And so while these propositions are going to help us and boost and kind of get us caught up, I think if everybody walks away with the clear understanding that continuous upgrade and maintenance and letting new technologies be supported through public policy, local engagement, and just investment statewide is going to be important for all of these utilities. So while these propositions are very important to get us to today's needs, if everybody just understands and work with your legislators to come up with more long-term solutions, because it's going to continue to be an investment in order to make us the great state and I think the term earlier was used, the miracle economy that we have is because of all of these utilities. We need to continue to invest in these utilities in order to keep this state great.
And I think we take our water, electricity, and broadband for granted when it's working, but have it be cut off and you really notice the absence. And so the question about what can we do in rural areas, there are 14 propositions on the ballot that may lead to fatigue in the voting process, but making sure that people understand that it is important. I look at it as opportunities to vote for rural by passing some of these constitutional amendments.
Awesome, thank you. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. Let's thank our panelists.
If our panel can go ahead and stay there we're doing just a couple closing comments. First, want to thank everyone at Angelina College for hosting us in person, the events team here with the Tribune, those who are joining us, again, in person and online. But as we close this three-panel conversation on why the ballot matters, just want to have some closing comments first from our Regions editor, Nick Garcia.
Thank you for clapping. No, who said that? So before we get into the election, just one last shout out for y'all. If you did not sign up before the newsletter went out today, please do so. My inbox is already getting reviews from readers who said they loved it, so hopefully you will too. Again, just a couple of quick important dates. I am sure everybody in this room and watching online is registered to vote and plans to do so. Your Texas Tribune readers, after all. You wouldn't be here if you weren't interested, but maybe you and your friends are, maybe some of your friends aren't, and you might want to know about some of these dates to share with them. 5 days left to register to vote, October 10th. Early voting starts October 23rd. The last date to request a mail-in ballot is October 27th. And of course, election day is November 7th. So we are less or just over a month away from election day. And as we've heard, tons of really, really, really important issues that matter to the state and particularly East Texas. Thank you for being such great hosts for us here. We love coming to East Texas, and we will be back. And on that note, I will hand it over to Editor-in-Chief Sewell.
Thank you all so much. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, our 50 journalists in 9 cities across Texas, including right here in Lufkin, we're just so grateful for the level of engagement, curiosity, openness, and commitment to civic values that you all represent. I look forward to the next time I can be back in East Texas, and thank you all in person and online for joining this discussion.